Welcome to Science at FMNH, a podcast and video series that explores the behind-the-scenes science, collections, and research at Chicago's Field Museum. We continue our discussion with Ryan Williams to explore his research on trade and political relationships between early states in South America.
So right now, and for the past decade and a half, I've been actually involved in understanding the emergence of one of the Peru's first empires, one of the first empires actually in South America. The Wari emerged in central Peru around 550 or 600 AD. And I have actually been investigating how this expansive state, this first example of a government that incorporated peoples of very different ethnicities, even different language groups, into a single political focus. And I'm really interested in understanding the economic systems and how they managed to weave these very disparate groups together through the trade and exchange of goods. Now, my own research in recent times has been in the far southern realm of the Warri's empire, where they arrived very close to their origin period, around 600 AD. They traveled about 500 kilometers south of their capital and established a frontier settlement actually in direct competition with another expansive polity at the time that was called the Tiwanaku. So this is really the first evidence in the entire history of South America that two of the earliest empires, come together and begin interacting. And so I'm really interested in understanding how and under what basis did this interaction occur. Was there a great deal of conflict and animosity? Did trade and exchange form a role in terms of forging alliances or forging periods of détente in this relationship? I've used elemental analysis and compositional analysis to begin to address how did Wari establish that frontier settlement? How did they provision it with goods and services and create alliances with the imperial elites who were in the center? And then how did they cross those very distinctive political lines to forge relationships through economic exchange with these Tiwanaku settlers who were coming under a very different imperial regime and had a very different set of cultural beliefs? So how did they reconcile this kind of conflictive nature? Now, our research has demonstrated that they were able to sustain that settlement in concert with the Tiwanaku settlement, with Tiwanaku settlements down valley for over 400 years. In no point in time did one empire conquer the other in that area. So they both sustained these independent settlements. It's a very distinctive kind of system from what we see in many cases today, because eventually we see one group take dominion over the other. So how did economics play into that relationship is one of the big questions we're trying to answer. And is it a model for us today for peaceful coexistence of societies today without having one kind of dominate the other? One of the foci of my work has been looking at ceramic analysis. Ceramics are the all-purpose container, if you will, of the ancient peoples of Peru. They were also a means of displaying in highly decorated and painted forms their value systems, their religious beliefs, their political allegiances, as they painted them on the outside of these ceramic vessels. I'm really interested in understanding if these objects are carrying such heavily charged beliefs, where are they being made? How are they being distributed to the population? Who in the population is getting them? And how are they tracing these back? In Inca times, the Inca are one of the most well-known later societies of the later empires of the Andes. They emerged about 1,000 years after the Wari emerged and about 300 years or 400 years after the Wari had collapsed. We've been able to demonstrate, our scientists have been able to demonstrate a kind of a command centralization, if you will, of ceramic production, that there were several major Inca ceramic production centers that then distributed those throughout the empire. Did that same model work for Wari? That was one of the questions that we are trying to answer. We've actually now been able to demonstrate that Wari had very important centralized production centers, but they were not distributing them across the empire. They were importing the ideas. Perhaps even the potters who were very specialized in making these ceramics. And they were bringing them to these provincial areas, these provincial centers, where they would produce for the local economic consumption. We've also found that the highly decorated forms that the Wari used were predominantly used in feasting events by Wari chiefs and elites, Wari leaders predominantly. Only rarely do we find evidence of these highly decorated ceramic forms in the kind of more commoner houses in the outskirts of the provincial centers. So this tells us that this was a very different type of economic organization than that later Inca system. And it also tells us that ceramics at this point in time, the highly decorated and iconographically charged ceramics, were being used as a means to kind of control allegiances of elites and local leaders, and that was how Wari political systems were working. So in fact, economics informs how political arrangements work as well in this case. So our work has actually involved going out throughout the landscape around these Wari provincial centers and starting to collect raw clay samples from there in order to identify and chart out across the landscape where raw materials for local production may have come from. And we test the chemistries, the elemental chemistries of those clay samples, and we match them up to the elemental chemistries of the ceramics so that we can begin to find out where are the highly Wari charged ceramics coming from. And we found in the case of Cerro Baul, the Wari site I'm working on the Tiwanaku frontier, that the ceramics are being produced on top of this mountain in the midst of this sacred provincial center, and the clay is coming from an adjacent mountain that no one else is apparently allowed to use because all of the other ceramics from the adjacent communities and even from the Tiwanaku local communities have different clay signatures from different parts of the valley. So they're making their ceramics in a highly ritually charged environment. They're drawing them from a special clay source that others can't use, and then they're distributing them very selectively to the local leaders they want to have those goods. It's actually a very highly kind of controlled system with these particular highly decorated and richly charged ceramics.